Alright, so in this chapter we're going to be focusing on interpersonal communication. And a lot of this is going to look at relationships. So at the core of interpersonal communication is this notion that at the foundation of any relationship is communication. And without communication, relationships couldn't form, and therefore communication is inherent to our interpersonal relationships. So to give kind of a working definition of interpersonal communication, this is communication with or between persons who approach one another as individuals in a relationship. Um, so again, at the foundation of any relationship is communication, and there's a specific type of communication in interpersonal relationships. In interpersonal relationships, this can be relationships with family members, relationships with friends, relationships with people in the workplace, relationships with your classmates in your classes, or your fraternity or sororities, or your teammates, or whatever student clubs you belong to. It's basically the communication that occurs between any individual that you have any kind of meaningful relationship with. So how does communication help us meet our relational goals is one way of kind of looking at interpersonal communication. When we're in relationships and there's things that we want to accomplish, or negotiations that we want to maintain, or rules that we want to maintain, or feelings that we want to express, or that bond that we want to have remain between yourself and somebody else. It's through communication that these interpersonal needs are met, and it's interpersonal communication that does it. So we'll talk about forming relationships for a little bit. We'll talk about relationships and kind of how they fall apart, and then we'll talk about a few theories the rest of the way. But first, with forming relationships, one of the key things, it comes down to proxemics and proximity. Referring to the distance between two people, we're more likely to form relationships with people who are in close proximity to us. So that's why a lot of times you become friends with the people that you work with. Some of you are probably in school right now and have part-time jobs, and I'm sure you've developed friendships with the people that you work with, or you've developed friendships with people in class, or your first semester, going away to college, going away to Western. I'm sure you formed some relationships with people in your classrooms, or during orientation week, or in the dorm rooms when you were first getting to know people. If you really think about it, most of the relationships that you have, most of your friendships, most of your relationships, most of your professional working relationships, these are relationships with people you have because at some point you were probably really proximically close with them. There's also features of attraction that take place. So we develop relationships with people that are close to us, but then there's also features of attraction that play a role. There's physical attraction. The degree to which you find the bodily traits of another person pleasing and desirable. We often think of this in romantic terms, or the sex in which we're attracted to. This plays a role, which is true. This does happen in romantic relationships. However, we tend to also develop friendships and other interpersonal relationships with people that we find attractive, or pleasing or desirable. This doesn't have to mean sexually or romantically attractive, but just people that we are attracted to because maybe we're really tall and big, so we like hanging out with people that are tall and big, or we're small, short, and skinny, so we like hanging out with people that are small, short, and skinny. Um, and this kind of leads to these next two things, which is the halo effect and the horn effect. And the halo effect is basically the tendency to let our perceptions of one positive trait influence our perceptions of other positive traits. So if we first meet somebody and the first thing they do is make us laugh and we find them really, really funny, the behaviors and the actions that they take moving forward, or the things that they say moving forward in that relationship, or when you watch them talk with other people, you might attribute them to being funny, like, oh, that's just how Steve is. He's a funny guy like that. The horn effect is the opposite. This is when we have one negative impression of somebody and then we attribute the rest of their actions and behaviors to that negative trait. So say when you're first meeting somebody, they say something rude to you or they come across as mean. Everything that they do moving forward, you're going to attribute to them being a mean individual. So the halo effect, we see everything in a really positive light, and in the horn effect, we see everything in a very negative light, in terms of of another person and their actions, behaviors, and communication, all based on that initial perception that we gained of them. There's also social attraction and matching hypothesis. Social attraction is basically an individual's actions and personality. This entails features that draw you to another person, basically what it is about the way that they talk, the way that they interact, the way that they behave in society, the way that they behave in groups, the way that they act in front of their friends, what it is about them, and how do they behave that attracts you to them. And the matching hypothesis says we tend to form relationships with people who are comparable to us in terms of physical attractiveness. So we focus on how do people kind of interact out in social settings, and then also how much do they kind of look like us? You know, how much of ourselves do we see in that person? How much can we relate to them based on how they compare to us in terms of physical attractiveness? How do we find them socially attractive? All these things we consider when we're forming relationships with friends or meaningful others in our lives. So there's different models of relationship formation. We'll focus on two. There's linear models and the social penetration theory type model. Linear models explain how people come together and break apart. It goes basically in stages. Step one, this happens. Step two, this happens. Step three, this happens. And then boom, ultimately the goal of having a relationship's there. And it's kind of descriptive instead of prescriptive. It doesn't say this is exactly how it works, but more than anything, it tries to describe how relationship formation takes place. Social penetration theory is one of my favorite theories, and what this looks at is how relationships progress towards intimacy as a result of self-disclosure from both partners. It looks at how relationships grow based on the information you're willing to share with another person, how much you're willing to open up, and how much that person is willing to reciprocate and in turn open up to you, and how the sharing of that information and that opening up is really how the relationship is built, that trust in sharing that information with one another. Self-disclosures refer to the act of revealing info, and they basically focus on breadth and depth. So breadth, and we'll talk about this in a second, but it's kind of like an onion. Breadth refers to the number of topics, or the range of topics that are discussed. And the depth is about how deep you go with each one of those topics. So, you can talk about family for a little bit, but if you really want to talk about, so breadth would be like, you talk about, these are my family members, these are my hobbies, this is what I do and don't like about people, these are my pet peeves. So those are just like 4 topics. So that the breadth is those 4 topics. But the depth would be like if you focus on family and you go from, oh, well, this is each one of my family members, this is each one of their names, this is their hobbies, this is what they like to do, these are some deep dark secrets about my family, these are some problems that I have with my family members. Now you're focusing specifically on one topic and you're going deeper into that topic. So breadth, the number of topics discussed, and the depth refers to the amount of information revealed for each one of those topics. And if we combine those two things, this is really what social penetration theory gets at, is how we reveal that information in terms of breadth and depth and how relationships are formed based on it. So again, it's like an onion. And if anybody's ever seen Shrek, there's the one scene where Donkey and Shrek are kind of walking through the field and they're basically talking, they're going back and forth. And Shrek at one point says, ogres are like onions. And then he starts talking about how you got to peel back the layers of an onion to get to know one another. That scene in Shrek is literally referring to the social penetration model. There's outer layers, there's middle layers, inner layers, and core personality. And basically, if you think of an onion, you work your way from the outer layers to the core personality, and you keep getting deeper and deeper. So the outer layer is like superficial info. The middle layers are more personal, talk about attitudes, political views. The inner layers, this is like your deepest fear, greatest hopes, spiritual values. And then at the very core of the onion, this is the most basic sense of self. This is your core personality. This is who you are, and this is the strongest part. So if you think of it just like an onion, you got your outer layers, and as you peel back the layers, you get deeper and deeper and deeper. And when you get to the middle, that's your core personality. What's the strengths of this theory? It focuses on the role of communication. It really looks at how communication is the vessel by which we share this information, and ultimately it's through communication by which these relationships are formed and created. It explains the process of self-disclosure as a communicative act, meaning we have to, the only way for us to disclose information about ourselves is we communicate it. And it simplifies a complicated process, something that seems very, very messy. If you think about this theory, it really does help explain a lot in terms of how we share information, how the sharing of that complicated information and that complicated process of forming relationships, it really does kind of simplify it, make it a little bit easier and comprehensible. So now there's interaction stages. Knapp and Evangelisti came up with these models. There's 5 stages of coming together and 5 stages of coming apart. So this is kind of a linear. So we just talked about social penetration theory. Now we're talking about a more linear approach to relationship forming. So first, there's 5 steps to coming together. There's initiating, experimenting, intensifying, integrating, and bonding. Initiating is when we first meet somebody, first say hi, first come across somebody. This is our first interaction with them. The next step is experimenting. This is where we find common ground. We start to go back and forth a little bit, start to learn a bit about each other, try to find similarities and things that we like and ways that we can get along. Then it goes into intensifying. This is where there's greater intimacy, more affection, more attraction, more connection. Then integrating, solidifying partners as a couple, and then bonding. This is public and formal declaration that two are one. So this really focuses on, this was typically used for romantic relationships, talking about how two people that are partners kind of come together, and it's worded in that way. It's kind of described, and the terms used and the way that it's operationalized really still does speak to romantic relationships, but these 5 stages can still kind of be used to describe how friendships and other forms of relationships form. But again, 5 stages of coming together. If you kind of break it down, this is a stage model for how interpersonal relationships and romantic relationships are formed. And then on the opposite side of that, there's coming apart. It starts with differentiating. This is where we're asserting separateness of partners. This is where we're starting to kind of move apart a little bit. We're starting to feel things out and realize, okay, there's differences between us, and I'm not sure if we're going to be able to work them out. There's circumscribing. This is where we're restricting communication. This is where we literally start talking less and less to one another. There's stagnating. This is when the relationship becomes still. The quality of it declines. We avoid one another as the next step. This is where we literally try to physically avoid the other person. And then termination. This is where we basically say, okay, things are over. So what are the strengths of the model of interaction stages? It shows how communication moves our relationship in certain directions. All right, it shows that there is kind of like this peak, this growth towards, and then there's a peak, and in some cases there's kind of this decline, this falling apart, these 5 stages up and these 5 stages down. And it gives general pathways that relationships can take. So it's basic, it's not that deep, it's not that confusing, and it's really easy to kind of see how these stages take place in the forming of relationships and the falling apart of relationships. But there's a lot of limits to these models. Relationships are not this predictable. Not all relationships, not any relationship follows this. Okay, it's not like we're in a relationship and it's like, okay, well, we're at the point where we are now, um, it's not like you're like, okay, we're at stage 3 of this linear model. It's not that easy. They're oversimplified, and the process is too complex to make it that simple. The goal of intimacy is implied when it may not be the case. A lot of relationships, people aren't really seeking intimacy. They're just seeking some sort of friendship or somebody to relate to. Most of the research on this is based on white, heterosexual, middle-class students, so it doesn't really capture a diverse audience. It doesn't really capture a lot of people from different cultures. And external, meaning they are written from the point of view of an outsider who may not know the relationship as well as those who are in it, and they don't account for hyperpersonal communication. And hyperpersonal communication is situations when the affection, emotion, and intimacy that develops through computer-mediated communication equals or surpasses what happens to face-to-face. Hyperpersonal communication is intimate communication that takes place in online or computer-mediated communication contexts. None of the research on linear models of relationships forming and falling apart. None of this stuff is ever taken into account. Computer mediated communication. So then there's also a couple of the personal perspectives of relationship development. Honeycutt 1993 basically looks at cognitions. And instead of saying it's not the actions that you take or the things that you do, rather it's the way that we perceive things. It's the way that we think. It's the way that we respond to things that lead to formations of relationships. Behaviors. So if you're disclosing information, these things are only important because we assign meaning to them. Sharing information in itself doesn't mean anything. It's the fact that when we're in a situation with somebody that we're considering a relationship of some sort with, when they share information with us, we ascribe meaning to that. We find it important. And how we interpret an act and not the act itself is that influences our self of whether a relationship has moved to a new level. So again, we can act and we can do things in a bunch of different ways, but it depends on how the people in the interpersonal relationship are interpreting each other's actions. And we also have what's called imagined trajectories, and these are individual understandings of paths that relationships will take and where they lead. So we start to develop these trajectories early on about, okay, well, where do I see this relationship going? And we also have turning points. These are perceptions of events that transform the relationship. These are big key moments in relationships. This is whether it's the first time somebody stood up for you, or it's the first time somebody had your back, or it's the first time you told one of your best friends about something you've never told anybody else. These are turning points, and they really define our relationship. And our interpretation of the event changes the relationship. So certain things happen, and then the way that we interpret them lead to huge significant changes in our relationships. There's four main kinds. There's interpersonal or normative turning points, and this is where you compare yourself or your partner to the norm. So this is where something happens in your relationship and you start thinking, okay, compared to the rest of the world, how unique is this to us? Or how much did we follow the rules? Or how, is it typical for people to do this? Is it typical for courting to take place this way? Is it typical for us to have these conversations this early on? This is where you're comparing your relationship to what's happening the normative way in society, or the way that society is kind of socially constructed, what's supposed to be happening. There's dyadic. These are direct interaction between partners. This is when there's a direct moment that happens where there's interaction between you and a partner that's a defining moment in your relationship. There's social network. This happens within a network. So this is if there's something that there's an influence from friends, families, or co-workers that somehow lead to some kind of turning point or significant moment. And then there's circumstantial. This is where there's events beyond your control that you cannot help. This is if one of you might, get an illness or get fired from work or something like that. How did those moments define your relationship? How do those events beyond your control define the relationship between you and your partner? And there's communication of interpersonal relationships. Literally, interpersonal relationships are kind of their own culture. It's a unique private world constructed and sustained by partners. Interpersonal relationships are their own private cultures. They include identity of both partners and the relationship's own identity. So in any kind of interpersonal relationship, you can kind of look at identity in terms of three separate areas. You have your identity, you have your partner's identity, and then in the middle of that is kind of this bond that is the relationship itself, and the relationship is its own identity. So if you think of a rope, you're your own rope, your partner's a separate rope, but then when the rope gets twisted together, that represents a third identity. And this makes things interesting because you have your own characteristics, you have your own personality, you have your own way of doing things. Your partner has their own characteristics, they have their own personality, they have their own way of doing things. So you have these two separate identities and these two separate, people, but when they come together, there's this third identity that's created because there's this compromise and negotiation and bonding between the two of you. So you can really see that there's three different identities in an interpersonal relationship, and you present yourself differently and behave differently whether you're by yourself or if you're with your partner or wherever it might be, depending on the context, these three different identities really play a role in how you communicate and interact in the world. They're dynamic. They're constantly changing. Relationships are never static. They're never the same from a day-to-day basis. Things are constantly changing, and they're reciprocal. It really requires on this back. They really require this back and forth. It's created by relational partners and also influence relational partners. So relationship culture is created by the partners, and it's also it also influences the relational partners. So it's created, and in turn it influences the people. So you are the people that are creating it, and in turn its creation influences each of you and your relationship as a whole. Relational dialectics is another interesting theory, and this is the analysis of interpersonal relationships that attributes the communication patterns between partners to the existence of dialectical tensions. And basically what this means is it's constantly looking at these different spectrums, this constant pressure of going back and forth on these different spectrums that we'll talk about. And there's three basic dialectics. So dialectics is a fancy word for basically opposite and opposing forces. So basically what it's saying is in every relationship we need independence. So for the first one, autonomy and connectedness. We always struggle with and we always must constantly negotiate autonomy, meaning we need to be independent. We need to be our own person. We need to have our own rights, rules, and responsibilities. But at the same time, we want to feel connected and connected with our partner. So it's this constant interplay and going back and forth of, ooh, I want to be alone. I want to be my own person, to, oh, I really want to be with you. I need you by my side. I need to spend time with you. And this is different dependent upon relationships, but all relationships kind of negotiate this. How much are we going to be our own individual people compared to how much are we going to spend time together and see ourselves as a whole? Same thing with novelty and predictability. We want new, exciting things, but we also want some routines. We want some things to be standardized and easy to understand and predict. We also want openness and closedness. We need to share personal information. We have a desire to share with one another, but at the same time, there's information that we want to keep to ourselves and not share. And so there's different ways of handling dialectical tensions. We select things. We choose what we say. We separate things. We try to organize. We neutralize. We reframe. We do all these different things to negotiate our relational dialectics. A little bit about relational climate. Relational climate is the overall emotional feeling of the relationship, and confirming and disconfirming communication contributes to the relational climate. Confirming messages are messages that make people feel valued and respected. So if somebody says, you know, I need to talk to you, I feel a certain way about something, you being like, okay, I want to hear it, I want to talk to you, I want to try to understand, that would be confirming. Whereas disconfirming would be like, shut up, you're crazy, I'm tired of hearing this same old crap over and over again. These are messages that make people devalued and disrespected. So it's important to recognize when you're using confirming and disconfirming messages and knowing the outcomes associated with those types of communication. There's spirals of communication. There's self-perpetuating spirals. This is where each person's message reinforces another. There's escalatory conflict spirals. This is where one attack leads to another, where people are constantly fighting. And then there's de-escalatory spirals. This is where partners gradually pull away, so everybody can kind of get an understanding and relate to those through their personal examples. There's also destructive communication. This is defensive communication is used for attempts to guard or protect a person from an attack. So we use communication in very destructive ways, and then we get defensive when those destructive forms of communication present themselves, and these aren't healthy for relationships. And then finally, there are also always cultural influences in our relationships. There's background, religions, nationalities, ethnicities, generational qualities, beliefs, and values. All these things influence the inside and the outside of our relationship, both the ways that between you and your partner think, do, and act, and what you value and what you have strong opinions about. That happens internally, and then there's external forces that influence our relationships based on culture as well. So it's important to be aware that culture is always playing a role in communication, and it's always playing a significant role in interpersonal relationships as well.